hosting this session. So this is Breakout Session 3, which carries the title Preparing Cities for CCAM, What, Why and How. So if you're not expecting to be in this session, then you should leave now. It will be in one of the other rooms. So my name is Suzanne Hoadley and I work at Polis. Polis is a network of city and regional authorities promoting sustainable mobility and transport innovation. And we've been involved at Polis in the CCAM domain for more than 10 years, probably nearly 15 years. Our first foray into CCAM was the City Mobile project, City Mobile 1 and 2. Does anyone remember City Mobile? Please raise your hands. Way! So we're in very excellent company even. And today we're still heavily involved in CCAM projects. We're also an active member of the CCAM research partnership. So I'm working with Ingrid on Cluster 6 societal transitions, and there will be a breakout session tomorrow on societal transitions. So this session is focusing on cities and planning. To plan for CCAM, we really need to understand what to plan for. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to when we're going to have highly automated vehicles operating on public roads at scale. I think years, decades away, we don't know. So what do we do meanwhile? You know, what measures do we implement and really who is going to benefit from those? Why plan for CCAM? I think there's a growing body of research that's concluding that automating vehicles is not necessarily the panacea for congestion and for pollution. It could be part of the solution, but not the whole solution. And then how to plan for CCAM. So who does what, who pays for it, and who benefits from it. So for this session, we're going to have a mixture of presentations and panel discussions. It's a 2-hour session, so it's quite long. And we're going to have a couple of presentations, and most of the time is going to be devoted actually to panel discussions. We will have 2 separate panels with 2 different lineup of panelists. The first panel will deal with governance issues, policy, regulatory frameworks, and we touched upon that quite a lot this morning. And the second panel will deal more with the infrastructure. Now, the session scope has taken inspiration from the Coexist project, which is a Horizon project that finished about 3 years ago. And this project developed a method and tools to help cities plan for CCAM. And one of the interesting outputs of this project was a tool called the CCAM Readiness Self-Assessment Tool. And this tool has been enhanced in subsequent projects, and it's been applied in more cities. And we're going to have a short presentation on this right now from Wolfgang Backhaus, who is the Managing Director of Ruprecht Consult, which was the coordinator of the Coexist project.
Thank you, Suzanne. You can start the slides. As Suzanne said, this self-assessment tool is based on some results we developed in the Coexist Horizon project a few years ago. And actually, we asked cities how ready they feel for the deployment planning of CCAM solutions in their city environment. And we tested it with several cities from all of these projects you see here, Interact projects, and also Right to Autonomy, where we had 10 pilots facilitated of automated shuttles across Europe. You see it's from non-existent to very high. What you, of course, have to consider is that actually all these cities are already part of CCAM projects. So they are already dealing with this topic. So if you ask other cities, there might be a different picture. If you can go next, we can just skip the next one. Doesn't work? Okay, so you can skip this one. Sorry. So as Suzanne said, we have worked with 2 basic concepts. One is the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, actually, because what we are planning for is not CCAM. We're planning for mobility systems, for sustainable mobility systems. So CCAM could be part of the solution. And so there's a kind of a contextualized SUMP guidance where we say, or give some indications what's actually to be considered if you plan for CCAM solutions in your urban mobility planning process. And the first step, if you click one, is in the SUMP process actually evaluate capacities and resources. So what are our capacities and resources? You can stay there. In our administration, in our city authority, to plan for CCAM. And what we came up with is a so-called automation-ready framework where we have different building blocks from policy to users and different timelines, what you could actually do in such a phase for this building block to prepare yourself, your city better for CCAM solutions, the deployment and planning. So it's a bit CCAM readiness considered as the capability to make more informed decisions towards the solutions. If you go to the next. What we tried now with the tool is actually to transfer, if you click one more, to transfer these building blocks into a kind of a question survey, self-assessment survey, where we have these different blocks. So there are different questions. For example, is there a strategy for CCAM in your area? If you go to the next one. You can see these are the answers. So most of them don't have any strategy yet, or they have at least a kind of a vision to start a vision preparing, a strategy preparation. And there's only a few ones which really have already integrated this into their urban mobility planning processes. There's also a question around CITS strategy, because we touch on this later in the discussion. Also, you can see here, actually the C part of the CCAM concept, so cooperative or connected, is also not really covered so far in our targeted cities. So you can see 8 of them just answered there's no concept at all for CITS at the moment. Go to the next. These are just questions for different building blocks, infrastructure, traffic management. So have you studied the impact of CCAM on existing infrastructure? We will come to this later in the panel discussion. And stakeholder and the management of stakeholders. So we have 35 questions in total, which should give you a quick overview, a flavor, how is my city actually doing for CCAM planning and deployment. So in the next steps, it was really well received from these test cities. In the next step, we will link it to existing knowledge. And if you go to the next, and use therefore the knowledge base of the EUCAD from the organized by FAME to link actually weaknesses, the results, your weaknesses, to actually existing knowledge available on the knowledge base from the partnership. So this is a bit the concept, and we will discuss now the readiness levels of the cities here. Thank you.
So thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you for keeping that really concise. We've managed to get back some time that we lost at the start of the session. I actually forgot to mention before Wolfgang took the floor that you are invited to log in onto Slido because there is a question to you all about the readiness of the city or the area in which you live. So I think we have the details on the screen now, so I'll leave them on for a few seconds. And just for your information, we will also be using Slido for taking questions from the audience for the panelists. So the question is, what is the level of CCAM readiness of the city area in which you live? And while you are answering that, I'm going to invite our first panel to come and join us. So for the governance session, I invite Françoise Gaspard to join us. So Françoise Gaspard is Senior Policy Advisor at the Île-de-France representation to the EU. I think you're going to have to sit behind the desk because we don't have any microphones, so I'm sorry. Yeah, just take any seat. Don't all sit down at one end. So Françoise, I think a lot of people know Françoise. She's very well known in Brussels mobility circles. So she's in charge of transport and mobility at the Paris Region Representative Office in Brussels since 2008, and she's involved in many different expert groups of the Commission, including the Cities Mission Board. She's a vice chair of AirTrack. She's obviously part of the CCAM Research Partnership, ERIN, amongst other expert groups. The second panelist is Mika Kulmala, who works for the city of Tampere, and he's been there since, for more than 20 years. He's a project manager working mainly on ITS development activities, traffic lights, traffic information systems and the like, and he's a civil engineer. And he's a member of the ITS Finland board and the chairman of the ITS Factory. Our third speaker our panelist is Peter Stalens, who's head of mobility at Eurocities, the network of major European cities, and he joined Eurocities in 2008. And he works on a number of topics in the field of urban mobility, on projects and policy development. And he used to work for the European Passengers Federation, so he has the user perspective as well. And last but not least, our final panelist is Maria Wedenby, who is the head of public affairs at Volvo Bus Corporation. So she has a lot of experience in the domains of electromobility and sustainable transport solutions. And she was formerly City Mobility Director at Volvo Buses. And so she has also a lot of experience working with cities, authorities, and operators, and active in industry organizations like UITP and ASEA. So before we actually start the panel discussion, I see you're all down one end. So before we start on the panel discussion, we are going to have a very short presentation from Peter, about a report that coming from the SHOW project. So it hasn't been published yet. It's a very interesting report which looks at the ideal regulatory and policy frameworks for CCAM in cities.
Thanks a lot for this very nice introduction, Suzanne. If you can bring up my presentation. So maybe, meanwhile, I can say, so I'm head of mobility at Eurocities, network of major European cities, but also been working on automation since 2015. And even before that, in 2008, we had a transport innovation project, and that was together with Polis, where we worked on group rapid transit and personal rapid transit, so even previous concepts before automation became more fashionable. And yeah, so I put the SHOW logo prominently on my opening slide because we are part of what I can say is currently the biggest demonstration project of shared automated mobility in European cities, maybe even worldwide. In that project, so we have a big number of cities, up to 17 cities, deploying a fleet of automated vehicles in connection with public transport, and also operating on public roads, mixing with other traffic and accessible to users. And that's a very interesting learning experience. So we are coordinating the demonstration board within the SHOW project. And there are many lessons to be learned, but that's not the focus of my presentation today. I will talk about the work we have been doing on the regulatory aspects, and more specifically on local governance. And if you can maybe shift to the next slide. We have latency in the room. Not good for the topic. But that's the reality. But I can, in any case, already start. What I wanted to say is that we know there's not a lot about local governance on automated vehicles, because a lot of the legislation is still being developed at the higher levels of governance. The technological maturity, the large-scale deployment are not there yet. So when we started talking to our cities and project partners, it was clear that there are very, very few examples of cities that have initiated a strategy of local governance. So we had to be very forward-looking and look at a moment where automated vehicles are fully reliable, 100% safe, fully operational in a multimodal mixed transport setting, and where legislation enables operation of those vehicles without test drivers. So yeah, an imaginative exercise, I had to say. Why do we think cities need to prepare? It's because we know there are potential benefits associated with CCAM, but also potential risks. And I assume most people know the hell and the heavens scenarios that have been discussed in various policy statements in previous years, where, for example, there's a risk that automation will lead to more congestion, more emissions, more unsafe situations towards vulnerable road users, exclusion of vulnerable people. So yeah, many risks. And as cities, of course, we if you can, sorry, stick on that slide for a moment. So at the same time, we see as a city network the potential of automated mobility services complementing, let's say, the more conventional high-frequency, high-capacity public transport. So we thought it was necessary for cities to think about a governance model to ensure that the benefits of automation are maximized. And we specifically focused on commercially operated services. We know if cities are putting out tendering processes or they're putting out concessions for shared automated mobility, they can define the requirements for operation. That's not as much the case for commercially operated services. So in a more liberal market, I think cities need to be very well prepared. In terms of the legal competency, we know, and it was discussed today, what kind of legislative initiatives are happening, international, European and national level. But also cities have a certain legal competence, maybe not on the hard law, but on the soft law, as we call it. So it means that they can work with licensing schemes, with memorandums of understanding, with guidelines, with incentives. So a whole set of tools they can, my apologies. So a whole set of instruments that cities can apply to steer the deployment of CCAM. And the principles on which that should be based is, of course, that cities want to achieve sustainable, clean, inclusive mobility. Many cities have a sustainable urban mobility plan in place, and those objectives behind that plan should be the guiding principles for deployment together with sustainable urban mobility indicators. I also want to say that cities, of course, have already a whole set of instruments to manage conventional traffic that will also apply to future CCAM services. Think about speed regimes, urban vehicle access restrictions, the traffic signs, road marks, all of that. So we see that if cities combine that with innovative governance of automated mobility services, they should be able to maximize those benefits. Next slide, please. Thanks. We, of course, didn't only look within Europe and maybe small detail, but we know that, for example, in the European context, only the Greek cities have a certain legal competence in steering deployment of automated mobility services. So let's say the legislative framework is a bit more progressive there than in other European countries. We also had a look outside of Europe and specifically at the case of San Francisco, but not only. And we know that San Francisco also is quite positive towards the deployment of shared automated mobility services. In this case, for example, Cruise and Waymo, and we have Waymo in the room, I saw, which is great. So we have been closely following up on how local authorities in San Francisco are responding to the deployment, what kind of concerns they have, what kind of expectations, and how current deployment of Cruise, for example, is meeting those requirements. So we have seen from official statements from San Francisco Transport Authority that there are currently problems, for example, with, I've listed a few unexpected and unplanned stops, meaning vehicles stopping in the middle of a lane, picking up, dropping off passengers where it's not safe. They can also obstruct public transport, causing a lot of delays on the network in general. I also want to pick out that there have been incidents with blocking of emergency services, lack of transparency overall, but I will get to that when I come to my recommendations. where it's not clear for a transport authority locally how the vehicles are performing, what kind of impacts they have on the wider network. In general, yeah, there seems to be concern about inadequate reporting and monitoring, but I feel that let's say the dialogue between Cruise, Waymo, and the Transport Authority of San Francisco is ongoing, but we can learn a lot from that in a European context, and what we think cities should be prepared for. And if you can go to the next slide, and that's my final one. I will not spell out the whole slide, but just to say that in the context of SHOW, we did this report on adapting regulatory and operational strategies for CCAM deployment at local and regional level. For that report, Eurocities was in charge of designing a governance framework for deployment of automated mobility services. Basically, we identified 8 potential categories of intervention, so dealing with pricing and revenues, accessibility, affordability, and quality of the services. An important one, fair competition and access to market. Also data sharing, network and demand management, multimodal integration, not only with the physical, but also with the digital infrastructure. And then, as a final block, a wider look at physical, digital, and communication infrastructure. Maybe just to pick out a few of these recommendations, and you can find them explained in a lot of detail in the report, and I will stop there. We feel that when you will have a situation where multiple CCAM operators are coming to a city providing similar services, it would be important for cities to create a kind of level playing field for these operators. That means, for example, that they could expect those companies to notify the local authority when they start operating. They could also introduce a licensing scheme, which would allow the city to define, for example, price limits, maximum prices to ensure affordability, minimum prices to avoid predatory pricing and avoid overconsumption of automated vehicle services. They could also consider setting a cap on operator licenses. They could integrate the new mobility services with the existing local taxi markets. And maybe another important point I want to mention when it's about data sharing and network and demand management. For the data sharing for a local authority, it would be important that they can see the flows from the automated vehicle services. So from the specific vehicles, not only origin, destination, of course, all anonymized, but also how are the vehicles performing when they are parking? Are there unforeseen stops? For now, the focus is really on incidents. That's also important to know. But for cities, they would need to have the data to see how these services are impacting the wider network. A final recommendation I want to highlight. So one risk we could see, especially with robotaxis, is that it would take users from more shared use of public transport, conventional public transport. And that could be avoided by stimulating the pooling of services so that vehicles are not just running empty or with one passenger, but that there are algorithms in place which bring together different users and optimize, again, the use of the vehicles and the capacity of the network as a whole. I will stop here. There's a lot more in the report, but yeah, maybe I will get questions from Suzanne and I can explain a bit more.
Right, thank you, Peter. So that's a taster of a report that's to come out of the SHOW project. I think it's going to be published in about a month's time, is that right? Yeah, it's a really good report. I had the opportunity to review a draft version, and we as Polis, we can really relate to many aspects, many elements, because we highlighted some of them in a paper that we published back in 2018. The Polis discussion paper on vehicle automation, and I think the SHOW report has really dug deeper and actually come up with recommendations to identify really some of those those potential risks or to make recommendations on really how we can harness the opportunities that vehicle automation offers. And just coming back to the, I think it's great that it's looked to other parts of the world where, these level 4 vehicles are starting to be rolled out, like in San Francisco, because, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I don't know if I have any contacts here in the room, but there are a lot of posts on LinkedIn about that. And I read a very interesting article the other day, which about some of the problems experienced by the emergency services. And whereas maybe 6 months, a year ago, they would just laugh them off, shrug them off, now that the service is starting to be scaled up in numbers, but also time-wise, it's becoming more problematic. So whereas before, I think when it was initially introduced, it was mainly limited to nighttime, and there were very few vehicles. And I think now, if I'm not mistaken, they can operate during the day, and there are more of them. So they are starting to reduce the efficiency of the network. So I guess we need to ask ourselves the question, up to what point, can we accept that? Of course, we need them on public roads. They need to, we need to experiment with them a bit. They need to improve. But at some point, if it starts to impact negatively on the mobility system, then we need to ask some, serious questions. Anyway, so thank you for that. So now we're going to move to our panel discussion. So the first round of questions we have, it's really intended to provide an opportunity to the panelists to share some insights as to the CCAM activities they've been involved in, what they've learned, and how the experiences to date are informing their strategies going forward and sort of what vision they have. So the first question goes to Mika. So Mika so Tampere is a pilot site in the show. Lost the sound. And so Tampere is setting up a pilot in a suburban area of the city. And so I guess the question really is, what motivated you to do that? What do you expect to come out of this pilot, given that we know there have already been many pilots of automated shuttles in dozens and dozens of cities around Europe? So, what do you want the outcome to be, and what would the legacy be in Tampere?
Okay, thank you. I think a couple of reasons. The first is that Tampere has had courage to do things, and I think both decision makers and politicians and authorities, they have courage to develop ideas, systems, and we have a quite strong political support developing these kind of things. And for automated vehicles, for example, 2014 there was an initiative to us for our local government that we have to establish some kind of a testing site in Tampere, that how to develop robot cars and automated vehicle systems and so on. So there's one important thing, that there is a political support, and after that we have made different kind of studies and how to test automated vehicles and how to continue to commercial use and how to make implementation of automated vehicle systems. Now, other thing is that in our region there's a number of active companies and high-level knowledge of automated vehicles, and I think we as authorities have to enable to develop things with, for example, VTT and our very good companies in Tampere region, and of course 2 universities which are very active. And I think that it's win-win situation, that we have challenges and we have motivation to develop things, and we have knowledge. So with companies and universities and research, there's a good way to develop these kind of things. And in ITS Factory we have very good cooperation between and of course it's us some kind of business policy also, because of number of companies can make development and new things and be a very good way to this field. And the third one, I think, is that the motivation is that we are now planning and building our tram system, and 2018, in our mayor program, there was mentioned that when the first tram line is ready, 2021, we have automated vehicles as a feeder traffic solution to tram stops, and that was a very good way that we have to do things, and we are now planning the new part of cities, rails, and different kind of public transport systems, and automated feeder traffic is in the future is one of very important. They have very important role in that public transport system, and I think this was our motivation to do this kind of projects and pilots, and step by step go into commercial use.
Okay, so what I take from what you've just said is that, yes, you want there to be a service at the end of the day, but it's also an opportunity for you to work with different stakeholders, notably the research community, and to really develop new ways of working, new solutions, new tools, and so it's quite exploratory as well. Okay, great. Okay, so same question to you, Françoise, and the Île-de-France region. So we know you've been involved in several pilots in the region, and you've learned a lot, and you've been quite vocal about that in previous events, I understand. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for having me today. I'm very pleased to attend this important session on cities. It's not just a polite expression, it's because I think that the transformation of the road transport system is also a local and a regional issue. Before sharing the views, a result of experiment in Île-de-France, I would like to share general remarks. I think that CCAM is not a magic one, so we all know that very well. CCAM can help us to reach the climate neutrality, but CCAM will not replace the mass transit, but as a public authority, we need to find its place among a wide range of innovative services. The Île-de-France region has put the development on CCAM on the earth of priority for many reasons, because we would like to support the European and the French industry. The automotive industry represents a lot of jobs in Île-de-France, more than 17,000 jobs. And also, we concentrate a lot of money for research and development, more than 2 billion euros. Also because we put CCAM in our different strategies, our SUMP. We have revised the SUMP in 2017 and put targets and involve CCAM in our Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. And also because Île-de-France regions has decided to try to be a leader region in the development of CCAM. It's a reason why we have decided to put 100 million on the table to update the infrastructure that is necessary if we want to welcome experiments. Because we know that the main roads, not only in Île-de-France, but in Europe, are deteriorated today, and we have to start with the renovation of the road, and also to be ready for Olympic Games, because we will propose an experiment at this occasion. So the region is in charge to support the infrastructure, and Île-de-France Mobilité, the regional mobility authority, is in charge to propose innovative services. And it's what we did. We already co-finance various experiments in Île-de-France, shuttle experiments, and I already have the opportunity to say that now we have decided to stop this shuttle experiment because we never reached the targets we put in terms of capacity, speed. It was never possible for us to reach the full to have no safety driver in the shuttle. So besides good results in terms of accessibility, at the end, we consider that the bus is more efficient than today than the shuttle. So today we consider that the technology is not mature. So we have decided to stop and to come back to reasonable target. This not means that we will stop to support and to accompany the cities if they want to launch experiment in their territory. It means that we know that we don't now reach the moon. It's not possible today. We need to perhaps to have low expectation, reasonable target, and to launch experiments that we have at the end good results.
Okay, thank you, François. So I think like Mika and Tampere, I mean, economic development and innovation, they're important. That's an important driver, but also being able to deliver services to a good level of service to citizens at the end of the day is important too. One thing that strikes me, and I mean, you're not the first person to say this, is that we see CCAM as being something separate from, mass transit, high-capacity transport, like buses, like trams. But, I mean, at the end of the day, it's just about automating the driving task. So whether it's a robo-taxi or a shuttle or a bus or some other mode, it's still part of CCAM for me, I guess. So I think that's a good segue then to Maria from Volvo Buses. So what is Volvo Buses? Have you been involved in CCAM? And I guess what's your vision? Because it's true up until recently, maybe in the last 6 months, we haven't talked so much about automating the bus. It's been really the shuttle or the robo-taxi. But I know in Show, for instance, I think there are a couple of pilot sites that are actually involve the automation of the bus in very closed environments. So yeah, what's Volvo Buses been doing?
Thank you for that, and I think it's very interesting then to move to the focus and to like the bus traffic and see what we can do with automation there. Oh, sorry. Do you hear me now? Yeah, that's better. Thank you. Thank you for that question, and I think it's very interesting now to move and talk about buses and what they can do with automation in public transport. And in Volvo Buses, we have been part of some pilots. So we started out with electrification quite early from a European perspective, and then we also went into looking at automation, doing some trials in Singapore, for example, where we had like a 12-meter bus running a trial at the university site. After that, we also moved into looking into the depot. What can automation do for the depot, for the operator? And there we did a trial together with an operator in Sweden. And we find that there were quite good gains there, because in a depot where you move the bus around, it's narrow, it's a lot of buses moving at the same time. And then you can use the automation for taking the bus for cleaning and washing, for fueling if you would have like a diesel vehicle, like now is charging for an electric vehicle. And then you remove the risk for damages. So there is an upside there. We also are part of an EUCAD2023 project where we will test automatic bus stop docking or narrow navigation, because there we also see an upside that you will have less damages on the vehicles. It will be very smooth for the passengers to enter the vehicle and so on. It's also easy for the driver. So those are some examples of what we've done for pilots and so. And if we look into the future, to have a 12-meter fully loaded bus on full scale in the public transport system, we think that's quite far off at the moment. There are trials, as you mentioned here, but I would like to mention that there are other gains that we can take on the way to get there. And that is to use all this automatic functionality that we have already in the vehicles, like safety features and also driver alert systems, like collision warnings, driver and cycle detection, geofencing. There are a number of systems that will have a benefit, and let's start with those, taking these steps, because that will be a great part in the public transport system and increase both from a cost-efficient side and also from a safety side. But as we move now with the technology and also get the cities ready, because we have to have an environment where vehicles can drive, because it could be like bus rapid transport, for example, or dedicated bus lanes, where they would be perfect for automation. Then we will, when this technology is reliable and it's safe, then of course we will be there and will be a partner into that system.
Thank you, Maria. So that's great. So so piloting automation in very specific environments, so like in depots. I think we're going to see more of that, and I know we certainly discussed that at a recent CCAM Shriya workshop a month, 6 weeks ago, as perhaps being an important use case for the future. And incrementally automating the bus or certain functions of the bus, and getting cities ready as well, and making use of some of the infrastructure like dedicated bus lanes. So yeah, to sum up, that's great. Thank you. I don't know if we have any questions already on Slido, but I'm just wondering whether we should put the Slido details back on the screen in case people didn't get the opportunity to note down the details before. So if you have questions, so if we could leave that on for maybe 30 seconds. So then we'll move on to our next, let's say, round of questions. And this builds on the presentation that Peter made and the report that he presented about what are the levers that cities have to really influence the outcomes of CCAM. So in terms of sustainability, equity, so how can CCAM really deliver on sustainability and equity? And he touched upon some of those. So I think I noted down here, you know, cities, they regulate on access to public space for private and commercial vehicles through some of the policies that Peter mentioned, like access restrictions, parking, road space allocation. They can also license commercial transport services, but not all commercial transport services. That very much differs from one country to the next. And then, of course, they can procure public transport services. So that's very much the domain of François. So I guess a question to Peter is that, you know, there is this expectation, we've heard it a lot today, that CCAM is going to improve sustainability and equity. And I think we both agree that it's not a given. And it will require this strong policy and regulation from the side of public authorities. But which policies and other measures then should public authorities really be thinking about in the short to medium term, and why? And you did touch upon some of them already in your presentation. And then you mentioned that Greece is one of the few countries to have all these competencies. So if you could elaborate on that. And then I also wanted to mention that a few weeks ago we organized a meeting of our members, a working group meeting, looking at the regulatory or legislative developments related to CCAM. And we had a presentation actually from the UK, and I don't know if Jessica from the UK is here today, but they're actually, this is very much what they're thinking about in the UK when it comes to CCAM, when it comes to the actual piloting and deployment of these services, to really working with the local authorities, allowing them to have some say on what's going to be deployed. So I think that's a really positive development.
I don't know that much specifically about the regulatory role of cities in Greece. It's quite a recent development. I think the national updated legislation was only voted in December last year, and we had to include this as an update in our report because there were not any other examples we had identified. But the idea is that before shared automated mobility services are being operated in a given city, that city is informed in advance, and they can decide to either allow operation or not. We have seen from the demonstrations in show, for example, that cities are in fact already taking a kind of regulating role because they know that there might be some unexpected impacts of CCAM deployment. I think about the case of Frankfurt, for example, where the original plan was to provide automated shuttles on a busy transport corridor, but there was also a lot of high-capacity public transport running there, and there were doubts about the speeds of the vehicles and how that would affect the performance of the overall public transport system, where then the city eventually decided, let's take it to an area where speed limit is 30 kilometers per hour, and there's no interference with the high-capacity regular conventional public transport. A similar case in Turin, for example, where the shuttles were originally supposed to go on dedicated bus lanes. Again, there's this conflict between lower speed vehicles and buses that can go faster. And then, you can see cities are taking into consideration these impacts. And that's where you could see already these potential interventions. And in general, so the options that I listed there, it's not a full set that is applicable in any given city. It depends a lot on the national rules as well and legal competence of cities. So they will need to see within their own legal remit where they have influence. And personally, I think from the example of new mobility services, and that's where we took a lot of inspiration, especially from ride-hailing, because basically shared automated mobility services of the future will be ride-hailing without a driver. And we have seen how many cities across the world have regulated this aspect. And it starts with setting up a licensing scheme, defining the area of operation, setting certain limits, for example, on the vehicle side, vehicle dimensions. And there's a lot of inspiration that cities can already take from what is being developed with relation to new mobility services.
And within the show project, I mean, do you see that most of the pilot sites are really asking themselves these questions about, I mean, you mentioned what Frankfurt was looking into, and I mean, would you say that's across the pilot sites, or are they more focused really on just getting the pilot implemented and...
It depends a bit from one side to the next, but in general, they're very aware of avoiding potential risks. And of course, safety is a big concern, and everyone is very serious about avoiding any risks. But thinking about the rules and the regulatory framework, the governance, I think we're in Europe still very much focused on testing. And tests are performed with a limited set of vehicles for a limited duration and still very much in a controlled environment, which is perfectly understandable. And to make that step and think about the future situation where these vehicles will be operating in these very demanding mixed transport situations, that I think, again, that requires this level of imagination that we still all need to achieve together.
Okay, thank you. And Mika, is this something you're thinking about in Tampere? About this, the required policy and regulatory framework that's going to be needed in the future? Because, okay, your pilot is mainly automated shuttles, but there could be robo-taxis in the future. There might be commercial service providers.
Yes, but no. We have discussed only with the robo, this kind of delivery robots, but not robot taxis and so on. And I think we have to think that when the first one is coming to our region, then we have to discuss that that it's very important that we have our goals as a cities and our transport system, for example, decarbonize and what is the space, city space, and how is city space. So we have to discuss, but not yet. We have only these delivery robots and feeder traffic, automated feeder traffic.
Okay, thank you. So we have some questions, and they've disappeared now, just as I was about to ask them. So if they don't come back up again, then yes. Okay. So the first question then, oh, it's disappeared altogether. Otherwise, yeah. Yes, we have. Sorry? They're here. So should cities aim for CCAM readiness, or should cities wait until CCAM solutions are ready to be deployed in complex urban settings? So who wants to take that? Françoise? Yeah.
Okay. If I am based on the result in Ile-de-France and based perhaps on the to follow the French national strategy on CCAM, I would say that we have to wait. We have to wait. In 2018, the French government adopted this strategy, and this strategy has been revised in 2022 and took into account the result of various experiments launched in not only in France but in France, and they have decided to adapt the use case. They identified diverse use cases, in particular for public transport, and they would like to encourage experiment in closed sites, for example, or in areas such as university or mall or connection to railway station. So it's complex, but not a lot, I would like to say. So I think that it's just to test the technology, we have to wait. If we want to provide services, perhaps I will follow what the French national strategy said.
But then if we wait, we could end up with maybe a situation like what's happening in the US, where we have services coming in actually deployed. And we have, as a public authority, you have no influence over them. But then that also ignores the system approach as well. I mean, we can't, it's not just the vehicle, it's the infrastructure and everything around it that's going to need to be developed and to be in place, I think, even from a traffic management perspective. Are you going to be communicating with that vehicle? So I think there are some things maybe that need to be done, but I don't know if any of our panelists have an opinion on that. Another? No?
You mean really preparing in advance for?
Well, at least yeah, I mean, at least planning for it, because for me that is part of, if we go back to the coexist CCAM readiness, the diagram, there were different building blocks, as Wolfgang told us, and one of them was, getting the plans in place, making sure the infrastructure's there, traffic management, all these things need to be worked on. So that's the way I read the question. Yeah.
What we have been studying as well is to what extent cities are already integrating the element of CCAM into sustainable urban mobility planning strategies. Again, very few examples. I think Tampere is one of the few excellent examples we have where they describe future potential actions or services that could be complementing existing public transport services. What we say in general to our cities is indeed to be prepared, because we have seen, for example, with micromobility, very few cities were prepared when it's e-scooters, free-floating, bicycles, drones. I think cities are increasingly challenged to be prepared for all these unforeseen new mobility services. And while I think more cities are building capacity to deal with that disruption, they can simultaneously also take CCAM into the equation, because many of the governing processes that are currently being applied to micromobility, for example, are quite similar or transposable to future CCAM services. So yeah, that's the message that I think in general we give to our cities, and that we hope they try to take on board.
Yeah, I think the big difference with micromobility is that really did that was a revolution. I mean, that happened within like the space of 6 months. It was quite unexpected, whereas with automation, I mean, it's something that is been going on for some time and will go on for some time, so we have time to prepare for it. So maybe we can take the second question then. So this is about the show report. So again, a question for Peter, and to what extent you engaged ordinary citizens in the research that led to the recommendation?
Yeah, very pertinent question. By the way, first of all, I need to say that so Eurocities, we worked on the local dimension, but we had support from Austria Tech and IDIADA on the higher level of governance, which we also need to look at to define the urban, let's say, sphere of influence. So the way we compiled this recommendation, so we had city task force meetings, we ran a public survey, we had focus group meetings, so we tried to put many different stakeholders together, but we didn't have discussions on the ground with cities as such. That being said, all of the show demonstration cities have local demonstration boards, and they have regular user engagement. So it means that also ahead of the deployment, during the deployment, evaluating the deployment, there are groups of citizens actively involved. But for the regulatory framework, we have not considered it yet, also because even between experts, we had so many very complicated legal discussions. We had dedicated legal experts on CCAM, and it was just very hard to understand what exactly cities could do compared to legislation at national and European level. But I'm not excluding it. It could be actually an interesting next step.
Just perhaps on this question of citizen, in the latest experiment we launched in Saint-Quentin in Yvelines, this experiment was integrated in our MAS system, Mobility as a Service, and the citizen was able to book their journey in their application, the Île-de-France Mobility application. So we were very happy because 98% of the citizens approve this experiment, and at the question if they want to continue to use it, they say yes. So we were obliged to stop their experiment because we did not, as I said previously, reach the target we planned in terms of speed, and also because the shuttle encountered different technical problems, but the citizens were very happy about the experiment. So it's very important because we are in CCAM partnership. We have a cluster. You know that very well because you are one member of the cluster, Suzanne. But we have started to work on the acceptance of the public, and I would like to say that I saw a big change on this issue.
But it's interesting that the citizens, 98% of them said they liked the service, but it was the authority that was not happy with the service. So obviously speed wasn't an issue for them.
The problem for local authorities is we don't have enough money to spend on different experiments. And after COVID, in particular, due to the scarcity of the resources, we have to make choice.
Yeah, it's for sure. I mean, not every local authority can afford to run these pilots because they're not cheap. So we need to find the there needs to be a business case there at the end of the day. Right, before we move on to the final round of questions, we have just a couple of minutes left. I want to ask the audience, are there any public transport operators in the room here today? Raise your hands. Okay, we have one. Oh yeah, we have Andre. Okay, but then that means my final question really to Françoise and Marie is actually quite timely because I see that the public transport operators are not very, I guess, visible or active in the CCAM community. We have other public transport stakeholders, but the operators, so I'm just sort of wondering why, because if we want to move from piloting to deployment, and I take your point, Françoise, that, okay, the technology is not mature, we're still, there needs to be some progress in this area. But then we're going to need the operators of those services there. So I don't know, is this, this is my impression. I'd be interested in knowing what are your customers saying, for instance, Maria?
Well, we have, during the last years, we have had quite a few operators coming to want to see demos for automation, especially then for depots again, and see what can it do for them. So there is an interest, but then since we're also into the technology with electrification, I mean, they are very busy with just adapting to that new technology. And so there are challenges because it's all starts with when you send out a tender, how is that written? And is it part of that? Because otherwise, if you're in the middle of a session with your current vehicles, to then move to automation in a depot is quite costly. So it has to be cost efficient. It has to be a reason or a benefit for them to do that. So it starts with the tender and how the cities and the public transport authorities want to drive this. Then the operators will be a result of that, and their engagement will start with the city and the public transport authorities. Mm.
Sorry, Susan, that is not the case in Ile-de-France. We work a lot with the operators, but perhaps because also we are a strong authority, we have only one authority for 12 million inhabitants, for 43 million trips per day, so perhaps because we have also contract with operators, so we have a great collaboration with RATP, also Transdev Keolis on different experiments. And for example, with RATP, we have started to experiment autonomous buses. But yes, I observe also that in the CCAM partnership, we have a lack of involvement of operators, and honestly, the CCAM partnership has been created to bring all the actors around the table, all the actors of the value chain to exchange. It's not just a question of money. It's also a question to exchange and to move together. And yes, I would like to have more operators involved in this partnership.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're coming to the end of the session, so I'd like to give each of you an opportunity, maybe in 30 seconds, just to say some final words about what you would like the audience to take away from this panel discussion. Starting with you, Maria.
Okay, thank you. I think if we look at the more like for public transport system with buses, we need to take a stepwise approach, not move too fast. We have some trials out now, but really look into the system. Where will it make a difference here and now? Not move too fast. Start with the first steps that could make a difference today. I think that's what I would like to say. Thanks.
In the CCAM partnership, we have a 3R with goals, and I think it's not necessary to have more than expectations than that. I think that this target is reasonable to implement CCAM in a road, European road.
I think encourage to authorities to make open bidding processes that there is a business potential to companies to make not large-scale pilots or towards large-scale pilots to commercial service. I think that's the next step, and we need, for example, remote control centers and so on. But we have to do things and do projects, and after that, I think that we are ready to. In a few years, we are ready to commercial service.
I support what is being said about incremental steps, and I think that's also what we see in the US, that before going from 30 to 500, it's better to have smaller steps in between to understand the full impact. What I wanted to add is that, so I'm happy the fact that we have a cities session at EUCAD. I think it's important. In the past, cities were a bit neglected, while at the same time they provide, let's say, the testing grounds, and they are the areas where future commercial deployment will take place. So unavoidably, you will need to ask how they see that. So that's a very good starting point. What I wanted to add is that what we also see from the SHOW project is that it's very good to have local working groups that do not only communicate with local stakeholders, so operators, OEM service providers, technology providers, different administrations, but also with let's say the higher levels of governance, because the experiences that are being learned in complex urban environments are very relevant for the higher levels of governance. And to have these working groups frequently convening when testing is taking place and exchange those experiences, I think that's very important if you want to see any future CCAM deployment in cities at all.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're now going to say goodbye. We're going to say goodbye to our first panelist, so please show your appreciation. And we're going to start immediately with the second panel, so please don't disappear. Okay, right. So the second panel is going to deal with infrastructure, and I would like to invite our panelists to join us. So firstly, I'll invite back to the stage Wolfgang Backhaus, who's the Managing Director of Ruprecht. He presented to us the CCAM Readiness Self-Assessment Tool earlier on, and he's been at Ruprecht Consult since 2009. Mainly responsible for the team working on collective and intelligent mobility, and he has a lot of experience in coordinating and managing research projects. I'm sure many of you in the room have worked with him or his colleagues. And then Henriette Corneille from UITP, who leads the thematic area Automated Mobility, and so she graduated as a material engineer in 2007. And she, interestingly, has spent 5 years working for the automotive industry and 3 years at the Research Institute in Singapore. Then Michael Ivari, who is Senior Advisor at the City of Gothenburg and has more than 10 years of experience working with connected and automated vehicles from a city perspective, very important. And he is responsible for developing the strategic agenda in the fields of vehicle automation and digitalization, and he's also the chair of the Polis Working Group on Traffic Efficiency, so we work together quite a lot. And then our final panelist is Christophe Rombout, who is Innovation Advisor at the Flemish Agency for Roads and Traffic, which he joined in 2014, and he specializes in smart mobility and chairs the Flemish and Belgian federal working groups on connected and automated driving. So there was supposed to be a fifth person joining this channel. Now I have to look this side. Before I was looking that side, now this side. There was supposed to be a fifth person joining the panel, Michael Dinnis from the UK Department for Transport, but unfortunately he could not join us. He had a problem traveling over here. So that also means we not only miss him for the discussion, but we also miss his presentation about the ITF, International Transport Forum report on CCAM infrastructure. This is another report that hasn't yet been published, but will be published quite soon because it was recently adopted within the respective working group within ITF. So that's a real shame. But just to let you know, that is going to be coming out quite soon. So the first round of questions again, same as for the previous panel. So really just to give an opportunity to our panelists to talk a bit about their CCAM experiences, learnings and strategies going forward, but really with a focus on the infrastructure. So I guess the first question to Henriette and to Wolfgang. You've both been involved in many projects on CCAM, piloting the vehicles in real world, but also simulating, doing lots of simulations as well. So what can you tell us about really the infrastructure implications of these pilots? Which infrastructure adaptations do you think will be required, and how have they been perceived by the city authorities, and are they scalable? So maybe, Henriette, you first.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne, and hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. So again, about show, so you have heard a lot, it has been mentioned several times. Regarding the infrastructure and the project and the way the cities, so we have 16 cities in the project and follower side, so it's very large. It was very different. There were some cities where it was where the focus on, for example, V2X was a topic, so there was academic partners working on particular interaction with the traffic light and so on, and it was a use case particularly to look at that. But since I work from UITP, the International Association of Public Transport, there are some use cases that I really like in the project, some sites where actually the vehicles were deployed without heavily impact or needs from the infrastructure point of view. So really this idea of frugal infrastructure where it lies more on the vehicle side. And also, since I'm interested very much into the public transport point of view, if I may give an example, because the Frankfurt site was mentioned, and it's a very interesting site. In the project, we had, they were, as Peter mentioned, they were kind of looking where to implement. They were interested in automation, and they wanted to select the best place to do that. And what they noticed is they had already an on-demand service, public service, in a remote area in the city, providing a service between a retirement home and a grocery store. And they had already, like as public transport authority and operators, kind of the obligation, if I may say, to provide a service to this population with a driver. And what happened, and it was an on-demand service, so they had a booking, they have a booking app already. Everything is kind of in place from this digital infrastructure point of view, mostly for booking the service, everything was there. And there they noticed that the entire day, there was a lot of kind of lost time because the driver was waiting so many hours for services, if it was not always needed. And for them, automation, in this context of shared on-demand mobility, automation was kind of natural next step without having a big impact or a big need for retrofitting the infrastructure and everything, because they had already the pickup and drop-off point. They were already planned with their on-demand service, like mainly driven service. They had that, they had the booking service in place, so it's kind of fed naturally. So that's an example that I really like to take as what we call like really like this low-hanging fruits. So no need to make huge investment and everything, but there are already some nice use cases where we can deploy the vehicles. And what I really like about this site as well, it runs for more than 12 months, is the people, the elderly people from the retirements are using the service really naturally to go to the grocery stores and come back with all their groceries. And I really like this type of integration being very smooth and without heavy impact from the infrastructure point of view.
Yeah, I can actually just confirm in terms of the pilots we have facilitated that there wasn't that much need for retrofitting also the new technologies like sensors, roadside units. It worked all quite well actually from a technology perspective. maybe in addition to drop pickup zones, the charging topic was here and there a topic, because due to the, let's say, low performance in terms of speed and the distance to depots, sometimes it wasn't really useful to have the vehicle going across the whole town to the depot, so they searched for charging spots at site near to the line. And that was actually something more difficult, because in European cities, space is actually very limited. So they had to be sometimes creative to find solutions. There was even a camping site which offered, let's say, a stand-up or parking spot for a shuttle. And due to the performance, I would also say there are needs adjustments more in the existing ecosystem and the infrastructure. So they had to adjust traffic light phases due to the low speed. Speed limits from 50 to 30 to at least smoothen a little bit in the speed of these shuttles to the other vehicles on the road. So I think it's more these things and aspects which need to be considered when you have the pilots, and it's not the large infrastructure change.
So it's interesting you talk about the charging, because maybe this is something to think about for the future for the large-scale demonstrations. And I think this point was made during one of the panels this morning, that you know, the actual routes or the areas that are going to be selected for the large-scale demonstration, there has to be that charging capability there as well, and the pick-up and drop-offs. That's something we don't always talk about enough, but of course that's really important. Okay, then coming to Michael. So as I introduced, when I introduced you, you're very active in connected and automated driving projects, and especially in digital projects and initiatives. So what would you say really are the main infrastructure evolutions that are going to be needed on the road for CCAM, and are cities ready for these evolutions?
Thank you very much, Susanne. Move it this way. Yeah, we've been around for a long time. I think we've been on the road to automation for almost 10 years right now. That was when the industry first knocked on the door at the city of Gothenburg, and they introduced the concept of automated vehicles. And I think it was pretty clear to us already back then the potential benefits of this new technology. Then coming back, what is needed, we've heard it in previous panels, it will be data that fuels the future transportation system, and electricity, we heard in the previous panel. But they both share the need for effective communication. So the communication layer, I think, is key to progression. And what is new to us as a local road authority is that we no longer need only to communicate with human beings that can absorb potential errors. If we make errors, we seldom do errors, but if we do errors, make mistakes, then the humans can compensate for that. But now we must also be able to communicate efficiently and safe with machines. Then, after a few years' time working with the introduction of automated vehicles in Gothenburg, we realized, and I think that's sort of consensus here today, that it will eventually take some time before there will be large-scale deployment. And we know that the target is 2030. So it's important for us to understand what can we do, what development paths are there that supports an early return on investment, as someone mentioned earlier, that the industry in the US, I think I heard earlier this morning, they are looking for use cases with early return on investments, and I think that is also what road authorities should do. And that made us focus on ITS, and specifically CITS, because communication layer is key, and it's very important for us to start connect infrastructure so that we can communicate with the different stakeholders in order to co-create services. In our case, we are focused very much on digital regulations. and traffic signal services. And then I would like to stress and make a point at the perspective that I feel is sometimes very often overlooked, and those are soft measures. I would say it's not only about setting up the technology. When you speak of digital infrastructure, you usually think it's about technology. But it's very much about ensuring data quality and ensuring relevance of data. And in order to do that, you need to have an overview of your existing workflows and develop them to support data quality and develop the right tools and adapt them. Yeah, that's my view. And then when this general question, are cities ready? There was a poll here. I think it varies because, as we all know, automation is still quite a scarce phenomenon on our streets. But I do know that in general it's very difficult for cities to generate enough resources. So that is important. So that is why initiatives from the European Commission and different calls, like cities' missions and so on, Horizon, CEF, etc., are very important. And I think that not all cities have the capabilities of being front runners, and that must not be the case. But then it's very important with knowledge sharing, events like these and other events for sharing information among cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Then just one question. So you decided that you had to focus on an early return on investment on ITS and CITS. Was that in view of CCAM, or was that just something you decided several years ago that was part of your general digital transition? So it was just to understand really what is the driver. You want to be prepared for this future of CCAM? Or?
Yeah, part of it for sure. That's an important driver. And we also wanted to make it more tangible because since it's my responsibility within the city and within my department, I wanted to make it more tangible in order to make my colleagues understand what is really actually going on. Because that is not so easy because, as I mentioned previously, it's still a scarce phenomenon. So I also, and we decided, and actually the Urban Transport Committee approved, we put forward a strategic plan for innovation within the fields of electrification, automation, and digitalization that was approved some 3 years ago. And then I decided that we should work with a strategic approach rather than a strategic plan. Because especially CCAM is a bit still in a searching phase, whilst digitalization is more right here, right now. But being able to develop your digital infrastructure and everything related to that will make you able to be a co-creator in the future transportation system. If you don't have this strong foundation, I think it will be difficult.
I like this term strategic approach rather than strategic plan because, okay, CCAM, as you say, is still a bit fuzzy and some uncertainty, so at least you're working in a strategic way. Okay, so turning to Christophe, so we know that Flanders has been doing a lot in the data and the digital space. I remember already 10 years ago, I followed with interest some of the work that you were doing to digitize all your traffic signs, and you were sending vehicles on roads a bit like the Google the Google Street View cars that were going around on roads, picturing the environment. So what have you learned from that? Why did you really embark on this project? And which other sort of similar digital initiatives have you been working on?
Thank you, Suzanne. And may I say, if you speak later in one of these sessions, we should organize some kind of CCAM bingo. I could have called out bingo earlier in the session because a lot of points have already been addressed. But following a little bit Michael's point as well, data for us is critical. We consider CITS as a step up towards autonomous driving or automated driving. We have a big CITS deployment program. It's all over Flanders, which is maybe atypical. We are a road operator specializing in highway and secondary roads, but actually for our CITS deployment program, we're taking on a role for all the roads, which makes it some kind of challenging, because as you say, data quality is there, but quality follows the data has to be there. And what we're seeing is it's not always there. And if there is one elephant in the room today, I think all day even, we talked about digital twin being enablers, or I have heard people saying that digital twin is enabler for expanding the ODD under which automation can happen. But digital twin for me means asset management on steroids. We haven't spoken yet or too little about asset management. Obviously, as a road operator, it's a core task to be an asset manager, but also in cities, asset management will become much more important. And the digital side of asset management, providing that data is for us, so important to enable those CITS services. What have we learned? We have learned that just saying here is the system and populate the data is definitely not enough. We are really embarking on an active stakeholder cooperation, and I don't want to play the violin of all the ecosystem words and everything, but it is so important to facilitate cities getting the data ready in one central system. It would not make sense that all the cities would, for instance, provide traffic sign information in their own database, so it has to be one database. And we are quite active in working with those data suppliers as partners. The cities are really our partners in this, because if there is no data, there will be no CITS service in those cities. Besides offering that central platform, we're also offering training. But I think maybe most important what we try to do is to bring some focus. If you want to do better asset management, where do we start? We are deploying 29 use cases, and many of those use cases are indeed using a traffic sign database. So rather than just asking the cities, update your entire traffic database in one go, we are saying these are really priority traffic signs now where we believe focus needs to go to. So next to standardization of the system and the process, because even a traffic sign is not that static as we would think. There's no such thing for me as static data. Governments and local city councils take decisions. So we found out maybe 2 years ago that the time from taking a decision to getting it changed in a traffic sign database can take up to 3 months. Mm-hmm. That is no longer acceptable in an automated driving environment. So we're looking on how to optimize that, looking into new technologies like linked data event streams, where if the decision is signed in a digital format, the data is much quicker to be going to the central database systems as well.
Yeah, so essentially what CCAM is requiring, and this digital transition, is for public authorities, city authorities especially, to become data managers and not just transport managers. And I think that's the big challenge. I mean, that's certainly something that we've been working on within Polis for many, many years. Wolfgang?
Yeah, maybe a reaction to this data topic, and also the session we had before lunch. So we heard a lot about enabling data sharing. So we have the initiatives. You say it's not enough, but we have this part of allocating the data, managing the data, providing the data. There's another part, which actually leads maybe to the 3 months decision time, which is the data usage by city authorities. So I think I'm taking up maybe a topic Peter mentioned. We need actually other skills now in city administrations to actually analyze, to harvest these data, to come to the right decisions. And I think this is something where we also have to put much more effort and funding maybe into the skills development, and not only the technology part of the story.
If I may add on that, and I think the skills, we see it within UITP, it's a big topic. The workforce will be heavily impacted in general by digitalization. But when I hear about this data, and when you say, for example, oh, we should put much more funding on this topic and so on, I'm a bit skeptical, because I have the impression we have a tendency maybe in Europe, I don't know, I will say something maybe a bit provocative, to overdo things. You know, like if you look at our shuttles, they are kind of over-censored. I mean, they are super sensitive with so many sensors on it, and they stop and everything. And I'm afraid we are doing the same thing on the infrastructure point of view. Like we are overloading the infrastructure just to be on the super safe side, of course, and safety first, that's for sure. But I'm wondering if this approach of equipping all the traffic lights and everything is the right one to do, and with data it will be the same. We had a situation in an Italian city where it took us very long time to get the permit, because the ministry was asking so many data. But really, so many data that even the shuttle, even Navia, could not retrieve this data from the vehicle, and they had to install new hardware on the shuttle to be able to retrieve the data. And if you ask us, why are you asking so many? Why do you want this data for? They cannot say. They could not say exactly. It was probably, of course, liability. We can imagine, right, the reason. But can we manage to have the minimum set of data to already? So, of course, we need a vision, something long-term. But just for the next step, the minimum set of data that could be enough for cities to try out the technology, to see how comfortable they feel with it, to see if it's really answer a demand, a travel demand. And I think that's something actually we should start with, right? That there is a need for this transportation service, and see how the population react to that. But yeah, I'm a bit afraid, I hope you see my point, I'm a bit afraid we are a bit overdoing things in Europe and putting a lot of effort before having even one vehicle on the road. I don't know,
I'd like to react to that. I think it's a very interesting, because in preparing for another meeting, we had a lot of debate on what is now the necessity for a digital backbone when we think about a robotaxi, a robo-shuttle. And some colleagues would say we don't need any, whereas some others would say we need some. For instance, for strategic planning, I have seen from the colleague here, I think it was Eurocities, that showed, oh no, it was you, that showed there were a number of issues in the ongoing deployments, for instance, in San Francisco, where vehicles cut out of the automation when there is a roadwork. So at least I guess we can expand the operational design domain by offering certain data sets. However, there is no consensus yet on what is the minimum digital backbone information that has to be made available for not just evaluating, but for supporting the operations. Yeah. And there, I think we have some work ahead of us.
Yeah, if I may just jump on that directly, I think that's the emergency situation. I think it was in Peter's presentation mentioning the disengagement, when the vehicle are disengaged. And I asked also the question to, so when I visited San Francisco, I asked crews, what would you like the city to put in place in Europe? Like I was asking, would you plan to go to Europe? And when I asked, what would you like to have in place there? They would like to know from the city if there are construction work. Maybe the city could share that, and digitally will make sense, of course, but also all the topic of curb management. So I have the impression we may have already the first steps. We may have the first element to have this minimum data that could be exchanged between operators, and more strategically when it is private operators and the city.
I do wonder if, I mean, there are many sides to data. I mean, there's the data that's needed about the operation of the pilots, so disengagement data, other types of data that authorities need to evaluate. And then there is the sort of data, I think, that more Michael and Christophe were talking about, and that's really about asset data, getting that in a digital format to enable these digital twins to be built. And in any case, we have legislation in Europe, as we heard this morning from Geert van der Linden from DG Move, that we have the ITS directive, we have the RTTI delegated regulation, and there are these obligations that are going to be there in any case. So this is certainly something that we've been working on in Polis, and really glad to see it. I think we all agree that we need to work more on the soft measures, the skills development, capacity building in public authorities. And I think that means that some of the work that we've been doing within Polis, with our members especially, really is to try and build that data capability, get our members sharing experiences about what they're doing in this space, how they're doing it, what they've learned, what they haven't learned. And there's one anecdote that I'd like to share because I think it's really very striking. And this was, I won't mention the name of the city, but this was a capital city, one of our large European cities that had wanted to digitize all its on-street parking spaces some years ago. And so they funded the work for this. They built the software. They brought in the consultants or the company to do the work. So there was sort of a manual survey of all the on-street parking spaces. That was put in the database. That database, the next day, it's no longer up to date because on-street parking changes all the time. So at the same time, the unit within the city that had initiated this gave, let's say, instructions, protocols to colleagues within the city council, how to use the database, all those colleagues that had a role in on-street parking. And 6 months down the line, the database wasn't updated. So all this money that had gone into, doing this inventory of the database, the inventory of the on-street parking, buying the software. I mean, so unless you get the buy-in of all your colleagues, it's just not going to happen. And that's where you really need to work on new internal processes, as Mikhail knows very well. Anyway, we only have 10 minutes left, and there's another. We've talked a lot about the digital and the digital side of the infrastructure and data sharing, and now I want to talk a bit more about the physical infrastructure. I think we all agree that physical infrastructure is not going to change. So we're not going to redesign our streets or for automated vehicles, but roads are maintained, they're upgraded. We buy new roadside systems to monitor and manage traffic, to enforce regulations and the like. And I guess we do need to start thinking about what are going to be the requirements of, the increasingly connected and smarter vehicles today and automated vehicles in the future. And I had a very interesting conversation with, I don't know if Peter's in the room here today, with a colleague from the Netherlands last week who is embarking on a new project to build a CCAM infrastructure roadmap. So they're taking 2060 as the time horizon and then doing backcasting and trying to understand, how do we need to redesign our infrastructure in the future, what changes will be made. And I asked for some examples because for me, we're not going to change roads. But he was talking about, for instance, it might be necessary to simplify certain complex junctions or crossroads in cities. You can imagine these cities sometimes where you have 2 or 3 lanes of traffic and you have all these road markings on the floor indicating which direction and arrows and cross lines, where you're allowed to stop, where you're not allowed to stop, where you turn left, right. And it's very complex, and it will be it's complex for me. And so even more complex for an automated vehicle. So he gave that as an example, and also perhaps an example that we might have to replace some complex junctions by roundabouts. So, this has been a discussion, I know, in previous years, talking with Polis members over the years, where you go through periods where roundabouts are in fashion, and then roundabouts are put in, and then crossroads are in fashion again, and then crossroads come back in. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were about that. That's the first question, because we only have 10 minutes left. And also, I guess it's a bit related to the data sharing discussion we had before. How can road authorities benefit from the growing number of smart vehicles on our roads? These, vehicles today that are coming off the assembly line. They're essentially sensors on wheels. They're generating a lot of data. They're connected to the internet. How can public authorities benefit from that? And what I find really amazing is that still today, public authorities, road authorities, have to spend millions and millions on systems to monitor and manage traffic and also to enforce traffic regulations. And it just seems crazy. That money could be better spent on the digital transition, on improving the quality of our roads as well, good road markings and road signs where they're supposed to be. So you can take whichever question you like, and I think that will be our final question because we close in 5 minutes.
So for the physical infrastructure, I think, as I say, in our case, in the things that, and with the UITP members, etc., we are not going too much in the discussion of changing anything. It's more, if I have a vision, of course, and at UITP it would be to have kind of a privately, this car-free city, with less privately owned cars parked everywhere, but that's another topic. On the other aspect, how public transport authority can beneficiate from these vehicles, same, I'm speaking from the public transport more perspective, it will be very useful if, to start with, so before beneficiating, if the city could have at hand kind of a baseline for HD maps, so coming back more from the digital infrastructure. Here I would like to point out that there is a new project, Ultimo, with the coordinator here, where they want to have a HD map model that could be used as a kind of a baseline to build on. So I'm very excited about it and to know how it will be further developed in the project. And we could think that after, when you have operators, even if they are private operators driving every day with their LiDAR, scanning all the environment, there could be maybe something feed. Of course, they would like to keep some of their data for them, because this HD map, it's a lot of money, and they spend, like in the US, it's a lot of investment are put on having this HD map. But finding kind of a mechanism, I don't know if it's too naive, but finding a mechanism to avoid that each operator has to start from scratch in every city doing their own mapping, and at the same time the city will have up-to-date HD map and avoid this obsolescence that comes super quick, like even in a day things may happen and you need to update them. That would be something that I'm looking forward to in the Ultimo project, to see how they address this topic.
I can imagine CCAM solutions being serviced in not too complex roads soon, also maybe outskirts, rural areas where it's more a question of network coverage. We have some basics to implement, like HD maps, road marks, quality standards for this. I'm really lacking a bit of imagination when it comes to our urban settings in terms of narrow streets and all these things. And we have a lot of them in our cities in Europe. I just have to look at my own hometown, Cologne, which actually has a network of one-way streets. And cyclists are allowed to go in both directions. Actually, this works only because we don't respect the minimum distance, actually. So AVs might have to, or I think they will be programmed to really respect these limits. So how can this work in these areas? So I think in these settings, we have to somehow redesign our road usage. So, and if we really want to become carbon neutral and etc., so we have to combine it with urban vehicle access restrictions, with no new distribution of road space to cyclists, pedestrians, etc. So I think for these areas, there will be a new planning paradigm needed.
Yeah, from my perspective as a road authority, a couple of statements. Not so long ago, there were statements saying that under mixed traffic conditions, or as long as there are mixed traffic conditions, we have to design the roads for the human driver, which I would agree to. However, that's not the end of the story. So I'm not going to use the word but, I'm going to use the word and. We already know today that there are some concerns over ESA functionality. vehicles driving on a main road that are actually reading speed signs on a parallel road. So already today, we should be considering machine vision in the design of the roads and positioning just of where we put certain speed signs next to the digital infrastructure that obviously, according to me, also needs to be ready. That's one thing. But if I speak to some R&D engineers, they also tend to tell me that physical infrastructure is less important now than it was 5 years ago from the perspective of automated driving. High accuracy GPS is there in the meantime. So the digital layer is really much quicker to roll out and is also accelerating in terms of functionalities, possibilities that it can bring to CCAM services. And it's also quicker to deploy, and it probably costs less as well. So that's like a triple win. Do we not have to do any changes to the physical infra? I want to be careful there. Let's see how things are evolving. In terms of connectivity, I do ask myself the question. We have been engaging, and a lot of road authorities, together with my agency, have been engaging in the Data for Road Safety initiative. I think that's a really nice example of what the future could look like. I think probably that needs to be upscaled. Now it's 8 use cases, but if I think about vehicles like ALKS, ALKS Plus, doing a minimum risk maneuver, from a traffic management perspective, we would want to know when a minimum risk maneuver is initiated, because probably if the vehicle stops in a live lane while traffic is accelerating, we want to alert other drivers as well that there is a potential incident there. So that could be use case number 9. And if you really want to make CCAM services, CITS, and going beyond CCAM services work, of course you need scale, you need market penetration. So under what conditions would OEMs or market disruptors be willing to connect to our digital backbone? I think that's something that needs to be debated much more in detail as well.
Okay, so the last word for Michael, because we have 1 minute left.
1 minute left. I'll keep it very
2
short
minutes.
then.
You can have 2 minutes.
Then I would like to state that, of course, the future is phygital. That is, the physical world and the digital world, they are about to blend. And if you don't believe me, I think you should ask your children. And this is important for us to realize. We need to seize that opportunity, and to make ourselves relevant in the future, we need to adapt, and digitalization is a very important part of that. The digital twin concept, where asset management has a huge part. But also not only to see public sector or road authorities as producers of data, we are also very much consumers of data, and we can, if we can combine the production and the consumption perspective, then we can make very good matches. For instance, if we have a road sign repository that is in very good order, we can use vehicles, especially new vehicle platforms, which come equipped with a high quality camera vision in order to sense these signs, and we can have an instant update of this repository. And I think that is the future, and for us, the city of Gothenburg, the future already started this winter with a very interesting use case where we, for the first time, based our winter maintenance operations on, for instance, samples from vehicle data in order to report back to us if there were still slippery roads conditions or if our measures had the impact that we wanted. And this has already proven us cost efficiency. So we had very good experience from using this. So closing the loop, combining the producer and consumer perspective for a local road authority can be very beneficial.
Okay, I think a very nice way to close the session. And phygital, if you'd never heard of that word before, now you know it, so please use it. Did you invent this, or was this something you picked up elsewhere? Okay, right. Well, it's already just past 4:10, so I think we're going to have to close this panel debate and the whole session. So I would like to thank you for staying with us. I hope you found it useful, and I ask you to applaud our panelists of the second round and enjoy the rest of the conference.